I'm Carol Egbo. I'm the historian for the Oakland County Park System. You're probably wondering, why would a park system even need a historian? When you think of parks, you probably think about trails, beautiful trails letting you experience nature. We think about trees when we think about parks. But there's human parts to parks also, and that's my job, trying to investigate the human pieces of a park, the history of the land that the park sits on. So I do study trees, but I study trees like this. This is a tree line. It was deliberately planted in a row as a windbreak by William Fillingham years and years ago. Right now, if we take a look at an aerial of Rose Oaks County Park, where the Fillingham farm was, you'll notice that row of trees there. It's still there that he planted. But what I discovered next to it, if you look carefully, there's an old foundation there. Now I wondered, what did that foundation go to? That's a human piece of that park. So in experimenting with some old aerial photos, I was able to locate a building where that structure was, that now is the foundation. It was right next to the tree line. But what was interesting was, notice next to the tree line, the actual house of William Fillingham. Now that house has been gone for a long time, but it's part of the park's history. So that's my job. How do you find the human stories that are connected with our 13 county parks? Recently, I was doing research on Groveland Oaks. Groveland Oaks Park is right along Dixie Highway. It's a special part of Dixie Highway. If you know anything about the history of Dixie, it goes from Florida all the way up to northern Michigan. But this little part of Dixie has an important name. It's the Oakland County Dixie Corridor. It's 23 miles of Dixie Highway that run from Pontiac up to the Genesee-Oakland County border. It's a very historic road. And as I began to research the history of Groveland Oaks and the farms that once were there, I learned that the history of the park was intertwined with the history of this incredible historic 23 miles of road. Now, what I discovered, though, it wasn't about the road. It was about a fiddler and a horse farm and a harvest device. It was really much more than just the story of a road. It was also the story of 6 little towns that would grow along that historic road. And it would end up being an incredible history that would take me to 3 other parks and take me to the history of those little towns. Now, where did my story begin? Well, I located someone named William H. Green. William H. Green was born in 1844, died in 1931. In early 1850s, he came with his family, and they settled right on a farm along what was then called the Saginaw Turnpike. Later, it would become Dixie Highway. They had a farm that actually was on both sides of the Saginaw Turnpike, and they had a house that sat right there, overlooking the turnpike. Eventually, William H. Green would marry Martha Hankinson. She was the girl next door. She grew up in the farm right next to William H. Green. Now, over time, William H. Green became important in northern Oakland County, and that was because William H. Green had a threshing machine. Those were expensive machines, and most farmers couldn't afford them. But William H. Green saved his money, and he got one. And then every harvest season, he would rent himself and his machine out all over northern Oakland County and southern Genesee County. So he was known to many farmers there. But if you ask William H. Green, what do you want to be remembered for? What's your legacy? It would not be that threshing machine. It would be that William H. Green was a fiddler. He was the community fiddler for a little tiny town along the Saginaw Turnpike called Austin, or Austin Corners. He was the fiddler for 50 years for that little community. I found William H. Green fascinating. I learned that he was interviewed in 1931, just before he passed away. And he talked about the fact that he'd lived in the same house on Dixie Highway, beginning with it being on the Saginaw Turnpike, for 80 years. And he talked about, I watched the traffic on Dixie Highway change from Indians to tourists and from stagecoaches to motor cars. I realized William H. Green had seen it all as he lived 80 years in that same little house and watched history develop in front of him. Now, just as he stated, the history was way before it became the Saginaw Turnpike. It began as the Saginaw Trail. That was a Native American path that ran from what would become the Detroit area into the Saginaw Valley. It looks like Native Americans were moving along that path for over 500 to 600 years. But what's the evidence of that? You know, historians, we want evidence. How do we know that that was the case? Somebody put it on a map, but what's the evidence? The evidence I found was in Wilbert Hinsdale's Archaeological Atlas of Michigan. It was something he put together in 1931. He gathered all the archaeological evidence about Native American presence in Michigan. And then he created a series of maps. And he put things like mounds on them, ceremonial mounds, burial mounds. He marked where Native American villages were said to have been. He marked where trails were. And on his map of Oakland County, he marked the Saginaw Trail as the most significant Native American trail running through the county. Now he also marked just to the east of the Saginaw Trail an important Native American village, right on the shores of Bald Eagle Lake. To the south, on the west side of the trail, he marked mounds in 2 places, and another set of mounds up in Groveland Township, just to the east of the trail. These were significant ceremonial mounds and burial mounds. Sadly, early settlers and farmers recorded that they were there, but over time they were plowed down. They were in the way of farmers' fields. Now, when the early surveyors came in and began to survey Oakland County as early as 1818, 1819, many of them, like this surveyor who surveyed Waterford Township, marked a dotted line on the survey map and actually labeled it as the Saginaw Trail. So this was a significant Native American trail. Now, Hinsdale also said, with its many lakes, the situation was ideal for Indian life. A path led to every lake. Early writers state that there were Indian cornfields and sugar camps that existed in many parts of the area. So we know that Native Americans weren't just moving along the trail, but they had seasonal camps along the trail where they were making maple sugar, where they actually had gardens and garden beds and were growing crops along it. We know that would change, though. We know that eventually those Native American people will be pushed off that particular piece of land. By the 1850s, most of them would be gone. They'd be on reservations within Michigan. So what was happening? People like Oliver Williams were beginning to move into the area. Oliver Williams was born in 1776 in Roxbury, Massachusetts. This is right outside Boston. What a great year to be born in that area, 1776. Well, he became a merchant. He was selling hats. But he became interested in the fur trade. So he decided to make a move. And in 1805, he moved to the Detroit area, to Michigan. He began involved in the fur trade. He also had a hotel in Detroit. He was even making cider at one time. He was going over to Windsor area, getting apples and bringing them back and making cider. He was quite an entrepreneur. And then he decided to make another move. He moved along the Saginaw Trail up into what would become Waterford Township. 1818, he claimed some land along the banks of Silver Lake. Right here along the Saginaw Trail. It was the only pathway up from Detroit into Oakland County at that time. So he chose a beautiful spot along the lake, and he built a trading post. It wasn't a log cabin. It was a big trading post. It was 20 feet by 50 feet at least. We have that in the historical records. And what happened at that trading post? He and his sons would trade Native Americans for furs, skins, honey and wax, and maple sugar. Then they would take that to Detroit and they would sell it there. So it was a trading post, not just a farm. He had a farm too, but he had this important trading post. Now if we look at that area from an aerial, look at the houses, the residences along it. It's hard to imagine that once there, right there where that star is, was a fur trading post. Now he did have a farm also. He mainly, according to historical records, was growing wheat and he was raising sheep. And interestingly enough, right where those sheep were grazing, Waterford Oaks Park would develop over time. Right here along Dixie Highway, on the same land that once was owned by Oliver Williams. Now, what would happen? People would follow. More people would head out the Saginaw Trail and begin to take land in Oakland County. Two of those people were actually traveling for a time with Oliver Williams. Alpheus Williams, who was actually his brother-in-law, and Archibald Phillips. But they didn't stop where Oliver did. They went further up the Saginaw Trail, just a few miles, to a place where the Clinton River crossed the Saginaw Trail. And why was that? They wanted to build a mill. Why were people building mills at that time? Mills led to towns and people coming in. People would come in and build a sawmill often. And then people realized if you had a sawmill, you could have a frame house. If you had a grist mill, you could raise wheat and have some place to grind it. So these were two people who were interested in creating a mill. The little town of Waterford would grow up where their mill was. So it began as a mill town. By 1872, it had 3 mills. It had a plaster mill and a sawmill and a grist mill. But it also had another important structure. It had a place called the Waterford Exchange. This was a huge hotel. It was built in 1841 and actually would last until 1970, when sadly it was demolished. Think about that for a minute, though. That is a big hotel for 1841. The entire population of the whole township of Waterford was less than 1,000 people. There were very few people living in the village. Why did a village need a big hotel like that? Well, the answer is location, location, location. Waterford was right along the Saginaw Turnpike, and that turnpike, that rough road, had now become a stagecoach route. Stages were moving from Detroit to Pontiac to Flint. And Waterford was along that route. It was a long, tough road. And so hotels were along the way, beginning with this one, where people could stop and spend the night because it took more than a day to get from Detroit to Flint in that time. Well, what happened after the hotel? Well, eventually it became a parking lot and Steve's Auto Center, just a small little building. But if you look past Steve's Auto Center, past that parking lot, you will begin to see the remnants of the old village of Waterford, the church from the 1860s, that white building from the 1850s, the old foundry. And right across the street, you'll see row after row of Greek Revival houses. So the history of the village is still there. So now we had Oliver's trading post, we had the little town of Waterford beginning, and between them, at another place where the Clinton River crossed the Saginaw Trail, another town would begin. It was started by Daniel Windiett. He was a miller. He'd been a miller in England, and he came into the area in order to build a mill. And he chose that spot right along the Clinton River. A little town would grow up there called Drayton Plains. Where did the name come from? Daniel Windiett came from Drayton Plains in England and named it after where he'd come from. Drayton Plains, again, would grow up along the Saginaw Turnpike. It would start as a mill town, and then, just as Waterford, a large hotel would be built. Interesting enough, in the history of the hotel, it said, horses stopped to drink, and the passengers followed suit. And as whiskey was only 3 cents for a tumbler, it didn't take long to fill up. So the passengers filled up, the horses filled up. And I'm thinking, if a tumbler was 3 cents, it was probably a pretty happy group that left the Drayton Plains Hotel. There are very few pictures of it from what I've heard. This is the only one I've ever seen. You can't see much of the structure, but you can see how large it was. And look at the people in front. There's something cool about this photo, because I was wondering, who are those people? But if you turn it over, you will see that someone had the wisdom to mark some of the families that were shown in that photo. So we have evidence of not only the hotel, but the people who were living in Drayton Plains at the time. What was Drayton Plains like in 1866? Well, the Free Press said, it's a place of no great importance. Yet it is one of the links which go to make up the chain, and one that may at some time, not far distant, be a bustling, lively village. What was the chain they were talking about? It was the chain of little towns that was growing. And it would become a bustling, lively village along that chain of towns. And how would that happen? Well, Waterford at that time was harvesting apples and potatoes and sending them out by train. Drayton Plains, though, would harvest something else that would lead to it becoming a lively village. It was harvesting ice. Why did we need ice? Ice boxes of the day. Drayton Plains was surrounded by lakes, and people were cutting ice in those lakes, storing it places like this, Pittman's and Dean's Ice Company. That ice company was located right on the shores of Loon Lake. There's a marina there now. In 1880, a newspaper account stated that 150 train carloads of ice every day were being taken from the lakes around Drayton Plains, destined for the Cincinnati ice houses. But by 1950, Drayton Plains was a sleepy little town again. Even today, not much has changed. But what caused that? Why did it stop growing? Refrigeration. Refrigeration came in, and people no longer needed ice. Now we're going to see a change. Drayton Plains and Waterford had begun as mill towns. First the mill came in, and later a town would develop and a hotel along the Saginaw Turnpike. Now we're going to see that some towns just began as what I call tavern towns. They began as small hotels. There was no inn. They just began as a place for people to stay along the Saginaw Turnpike, the stagecoach route. Now, why? Stagecoaches needed taverns. They needed to change horses sometimes. People needed to get that tumbler of whiskey. People needed some time to spend the night. One of those little tavern towns was Springfield. In 1831, Asahel Fuller built a little small house, and he turned it into a hotel. And what I think is the first example of competition among hotels in Oakland County, Giles Bishop did the same thing a year and a half later. He would build a hotel, little tiny one, right next to the Fuller one. And around those two little hotels, the village of Springfield would grow. By 1860, Springfield boasted one merchant, a doctor, a hotel keeper, a manufacturer of stoneware. He was making crocks and jugs, and two blacksmiths. By 1867, the town had grown. Now we had an attorney there. We had a shoemaker. We had a lawyer and a carriage maker. It was growing. But by 1877, the Michigan Business Directory only listed Dr. Bartlett and a Methodist minister. And then by 1900, it wasn't even listed in the directory. It had disappeared. What had happened to Springfield? The train had missed Springfield. The railroad had followed the Saginaw Turnpike for a long way. It had gone through Drayton Plains. It had gone through Waterford. It was allowing people to ship goods out and ship goods in. But the train bypassed Springfield, instead going through the little town of Davisburg. Davisburg would grow, Springfield would all but disappear. Today, if you travel down Dixie Highway where Springfield was, Dr. Bartlett's office is still there. It's now a pool and spa store. And right next to it is an empty field where something very significant used to be. This was right in Springfield in the village, but it was a large farm. It was the farm of Norman J. Ellis. He had come to the area in the late 1870s, and he had started a farm. He got interested in sheep. He was buying and selling and raising sheep. And then he realized there were a lot of sheep farmers in Oakland County. He needed something else. He wanted to sell something that was more scarce than sheep. And he chose draft horses. They were hard to find. Most people had to go to Chicago to buy a draft horse. In particular, he got interested in Percherons. They were needed in the rough, tough soil that had to be plowed in Oakland County. The roads were awful. They were needed to pull wagons down roads. So Norman Ellis took the family fortune, as he said, and he bought one horse, Ingomar. Ingomar had been born in France, ended up in Chicago, and was purchased by Norman Ellis. It was a very lucrative purchase. Using the money from the heirs of Ingomar and what he got from Ingomar's stud fees, he was able to build this incredible Italianate house right along Dixie Highway, a beautiful, beautiful house. But people began to tease Norman Ellis. They said, you've got this big, beautiful house now, you're a very successful horse farmer, but you still have that crummy old barn. You've got your original barn. Norman Ellis said, I will show them. And he proceeded to build what was, at that time, probably the biggest barn in Michigan. Now, he would make a change then. The Ellis family realized that as time changed and the land changed, people didn't need Percherons anymore. So they went into horses like this, Tennessee Walkers, horses that were used for jumping and dressage. The Ellis farm would become the home of the Dixie Saddle Club, become a very famous horse farm. And now, of course, today, it's pretty much gone. You just see the little horseshoe where the house was. And what about that barn, that big, beautiful barn? Well, it was fortunate because two baseball players, Kirk Gibson and Tim Burtsis, purchased the Ellis farm from the Ellis family. And in the agreement, the barn was to be saved. Oakland County Parks was able to, for just a small fee, purchase the barn, and with some grant money, was able to take the barn apart piece by piece. The work was done by some Amish barn wrights from Indiana, but it was dismantled, and then out at Springfield Oaks Park, right off of Dixie Highway, it was put back together, and you can visit the Ellis barn now at Springfield Oaks. But what about that big, beautiful house? That was another success story. We've lost a lot of houses and barns along the Dixie corridor, but this barn was saved, this house was saved. It was a private purchase of the house. It was moved back off the land and became part of the Ingomar Farm subdivision. Now, to the north, literally at the end of the Dixie corridor, was a small village called Stoney Run. How did it start? 1834, Smith Jenks and Thomas Irish built a hotel, a stagecoach stop near the county border. An ad for the stage route said, cheap and rapid riding. The stage would leave for Pontiac from Flint every morning about 6 a.m. It would pass through places like Stoney Run, and it would get to Pontiac in time for people to take the train at that time to Detroit. Now think about that. It left Flint at 6 a.m., it got to Pontiac at 6 p.m., 12 hours to move between Flint and Pontiac. It might have been cheap, but I don't think you can call that rapid. Hence the need for all those inns and taverns. But where did it get its name? Vast quantities of loose stone, boulders and cobblestone abounded in that area. It's a very stony place. It made farmers crazy, but it ended up being lucrative, because over time, farms were turned into gravel pits, and it became an important economic activity in that part of Oakland County. Now, interestingly enough, one of those gravel pits, located right here, right across from Groveland Oaks Park, is now becoming an off-road vehicle park. A gravel pit turned into an ORV park. Change over time, from farm to gravel pit to park. Now, what about Stoney Run? What's left of Stoney Run? Not much. This is about the only building. On the 1908 map, it was labeled as the Oddfellows Hall. But here's what I've learned. Sometimes when a town is gone, the stories of the town are still there. And sometimes the stories can be found in the closest historic cemetery. And I found a great story about Stoney Run. I was wandering in that cemetery and I noticed the grave of two brothers, John Fagan and Thomas Fagan. And I noticed that they both died on the same day. There's a story here, I said. What happened to them? Why did they both die on the same day? Well, what I learned was that they had come to Michigan in 1832 and taken up land in Holly Township, right near Stoney Run. They were very frugal. In fact, people said they were misers and penny pinchers. They saved their money as they farmed, and they eventually had quite a little fund, and they put it in the bank. Unfortunately, at that time in Michigan, there was a panic on the banks. And unfortunately, the banks closed, and the Fagan brothers lost all their money. Well, they swore off banks, and they swore off farming, and it appears they went to sea. They became sailors. They were very frugal as they were sailing, saved their money again. And after several years of successful sailing, they returned to their farm, sharing that same house, because they figured it was cheaper for them if they shared the same house, both had their farmland, but they did not put that money in the bank. Now, they lived there successfully farming, but then in 1893, there was a terrible, terrible blizzard. It snowed in February for days and days. And when the blizzard was finally over, neighbors went to check on the Fagan brothers. And what they found, as they opened the door, both of them had been frozen to death. One died of pneumonia, it occurs, and then the other one froze to death. Well, now you can imagine what people were thinking. As the newspaper reported, a search for money began a few days after the funeral. They knew that they must have had their fortune somewhere. One newspaper article said they found $4,000 in gold buried in the cellar in an old crock. And then as they began to search more, in the wool in the barn, there was money, there was gold. Under the floorboards in the barn, in mason jars buried, there was gold. Now, their only heirs were a couple of nephews who inherited the fortune that the Fagan brothers were never able to spend. But there's still more history about the Fagan brothers. Right here, running parallel to Dixie Highway, just a little bit to the west, is Fagan Road. And here at Great Lakes National Cemetery, that beautiful lake that is part of the cemetery, Fagan Lake. So still memories of the Fagan family left behind. Now, just to the south, Groveland Corners, another small town. Same beginning. 1836, Philip McComber builds a large log house and decides to use it as an inn, a hotel. He names it Groveland Cottage, kind of an odd name for a hotel, but it became quite famous in the area. Now today, it's a Shell gas station. That's literally all that's left of Groveland Corners. But remember, when the town is gone, the stories often remain. And my favorite story about Groveland Corners is about the first dance that was held in 1834. It was at the house of William Husted. He lived right on the Saginaw Turnpike. Well, now, according to the 1877 history of Oakland County, the settlers sent to Genesee County for a fiddler named Kronk, but they failed to secure his services. He was not at home. So they'd gone to get the fiddler, and he wasn't at home. Accordingly, as music must be had of some kind, a couple of women volunteered to sing dancing tunes for them. So two women stepped forward and said, well, we'll just sing so you can dance. There was a problem. Their repertoire of tunes was exceedingly limited, there being but two on their schedule. So they only knew two songs. However, they made the most of circumstances, and they tripped the light, fantastic toe to the repeated strains of those two pieces. Thus, the first dance in Groveland Township. Now later, the farms that had been around Groveland Corners and where the village itself had been, the land would be purchased by Dr. Lamar Matthews. He was an eye specialist. He had a clinic in Pontiac and actually started a small clinic out on Dixie Highway and then bought the land around it, intending to have what he called a gentleman's farm. According to the records, he got his first tax bill and he said, I don't think this farm idea is going to work well. So he changed it into a private club. It was a private club, exclusive membership. It was called Groveland on the Dixie. He widened the lake, he put in some islands, he had camping area, swimming area, and he even had a little exotic zoo where he had monkeys and peacocks, a big pig he named Excelsior, and a bunch of giant bullfrogs he imported from Arkansas, all in his tiny little exotic zoo. Well, it wouldn't take long that he decided to be more lucrative, he would turn it into a public park. And then it became Paradise Beach, part of Matthews Groveland Estates, right there on Dixie Highway. That park today has become Groveland Oaks County Park. The same lake is there, the islands are there, and I keep believing there are giant bullfrogs somewhere there. We just have to find them this summer. Now we're seeing a change though. Things are changing along Dixie Highway. The tourists are starting to come in. Remember now, the stagecoaches have been replaced by automobiles, and we'll see new structures being built, like the Deer Lake Inn. Motor out today, it said. Motor out from Detroit and come into Oakland County. Places like the Old Mill Tavern that was there in Waterford, right at Andersonville Road. And then would come the motels, like the Parkway. The Parkway's still there along Dixie Highway. It's Efficiency Apartments now. And then would come the restaurants, like the Howard Johnson's. That's still there, right on the shores of Loon Lake. Towns that would grow up along that historic road. But wait, that's 5. Remember, there were 6. The last little one, Austin Corners. And how did it begin? Thomas Twilliger built a hotel known as Twilliger's Tavern, and around that hotel, the little town of Austin, or Austin Corners, would grow. It would be part of the stagecoach route. And today, at the corner of Oak Hill and Dixie, not much there of Austin Corners, just the Marathon gas station. But remember, when a town goes, the stories are still there. And my favorite story of Austin Corners is the story of William H. Green, who was a fiddler at Austin Corners for 50 years. It was 50 years he was the fiddler at Austin Corners. He'd seen it all, from Indians to tourists, and from stagecoaches to motor cars. Along 23 historic miles of the Saginaw Trail, turned Saginaw Turnpike, turned Dixie Highway. A fiddler, a horse farm, and a harvest device. We had 6 little towns that would grow along that road, and then followed by 4 incredible parks. Well, I'm hoping you can see now that parks do need historians, because in discovering the history of a park, you discover much more. The history of the people who once lived on park land, the places that were around the park, the fiddlers and the farmers and the horse farmers. Parks need a historian.